And joining us on the show for further clarity, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow, Asia Research Institute and the author of Has China Won? Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on India Global. Events this week have served as a reminder of the currently low levels of trust as far as China is concerned. Would you say India-China relations are arguably at their lowest since the normalization of ties back in 1980?
Well, I think certainly China-India relations are going through a very challenging phase. I would say the low point was after the clashes in June 2020 at the border. I think since then, as you know, there have been several rounds of talks and been some improvement in the discussions on the border. But still, there's no doubt that India-China relations remain troubled. But at the same time, both India and China are expected by the rest of the world to also play their role as global leaders. People expect India and China to be global leaders. And if you want countries to be global leaders, you've got to manage your relations in such a way that you look at the whole global picture, what's important globally, and how you disagree on some areas, but still continue to collaborate on other areas. And I think overall, India and China are doing a reasonable job of managing that quite well.
Right. Professor Mahbubani, what are the biggest misconceptions about China as far as international politics is concerned, as per you?
Well, I think it's important to understand, I think for the Indian audience to understand, that the biggest geopolitical contest in the world is not between India and China. The biggest geopolitical contest in the world is always that between the world's number one power, which today is the United States of America, and the world's number one emerging power, which today is China. And the main contest that is rocking the world is the US-China contest. And I think many people were hoping that each G20 meeting will lead to reductions of US-China tensions. I can tell you that last year, for example, just before the G20 meeting in Bali, the president of Indonesia, President Jokowi, invited me for breakfast 2 days before the G20 meeting. And I told President Jokowi of Indonesia that if Indonesia can organize a good meeting between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping, the world would thank him a lot. And President Jokowi said to me, "Oh, don't worry. We have given them the nicest room in Bali." Bali, as you know, is a Hindu island. I must emphasize that. We've given them the nicest room in Bali. And as a result of that, as you know, President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping had a very good meeting in Indonesia. And that's why the G20 meeting in Indonesia has been deemed by most people to be one of the more successful meetings. And I'm still hoping very much that that President Xi will attend the G20 meeting and that there will again be a good meeting between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping, because the rest of the world, and it's important to emphasize, has got much larger problems to deal with, right? We have climate change,
Indeed.
We have potential global recession, we have the Ukraine war, we have many burning issues in the world. And if the leaders don't meet, then the world gets more troubled.
Right. Also, Professor, the rise of China has created a situation where most countries want to maintain economic access to its large market, but also do not want to be politically dominated by China. How do you read the situation?
That's absolutely right. I think nobody wants to be politically dominated by any country in the world. I mean, whether United States, China, Russia, Germany, France. We don't want to be dominated by any country. But at the same time, countries, the main priority for most countries in the world is economic growth and development. And if you don't get access to the Chinese market, you cannot grow and develop. Let me give you one simple statistic so you understand what I'm talking about. Now, Singapore is part of ASEAN, 10 countries ASEAN. Now, in the year 2000, US trade with the 10 countries in ASEAN was $135 billion, and China's trade with ASEAN was only $40 billion, right? US trade 135, China 440. But by 2022, last year, US trade had grown significantly from 135 to 440 billion. But China's trade with ASEAN had grown from 40 billion to $975 billion. Now, that's the world's largest trading relationship. I think many people in India know that ASEAN is a group of developing countries, except for Singapore, maybe. But despite that, we have a larger trading relationship with China than Europe does with the United States of America. These are economic giants. So for ASEAN countries, growth comes from trade. And you know, in the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times the size of ASEAN. Now it's only 1.5 times larger. So you can see how in the ASEAN countries, the way that they've grown so much is by opening themselves up to trade with China. Despite the fact, and I must emphasize this, ASEAN countries have differences with China also on the South China Sea. We have differences.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Mahbubani, for joining us on NDTV. It's always a pleasure to speak to you.